It's a little bit funny to think that one of the most comprehensive collections of space artifacts in the world exists in a small town in rural Kansas. And yet, the Cosmosphere, with the largest combined collection of Soviet and American artifacts of any museum in the entire world, the Cosmosphere is uniquely positioned to tell the story of the space race, not just from the side of America, but also from the side of the Soviet Union. Come with me as we explore the competition between two rivals in the race to the moon, the peril and triumph of humanity's greatest story, all told through the collection of the Cosmosphere. Our story of the space race starts here, with Liberty Bell 7. Liberty Bell 7 was the third spacecraft to carry a human being into space. His name was Gus Grissom. Now, Gus Grissom was a member of that group immortalized by Tom Wolfe's novel The Right Stuff, the test pilots turned astronauts, special, monumental beings in their time. Gus Grissom flew in this one-person, cramped Mercury capsule on a 15-minute flight following Alan Shepard, America's first astronaut. But at the end of his flight, he splashed down into the water as he was supposed to, and his explosive escape hatch blew open. Water flooded the spacecraft. Grissom himself barely survived, and the spacecraft sank. It was on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean for 38 years before it was recovered and restored here at the Cosmosphere, and it's now one of our prized artifacts. The story of the space race, for me, starts here with Gus Grissom because he embodies everything that America sought in its heroes. But he also embodies the risk inherent in space exploration. Only America's second spaceflight, and he almost died. Above Liberty Bell 7 is one of our more impressive artifacts, the SR-71 spy plane. Now, the SR-71 was built to fill a gap in America's intelligence capabilities. Satellites were not yet developed enough for routine photography, and so the SR-71 was made to fly high and fast enough to evade missiles of the type that brought down a U-2 carrying Gary Francis Powers. The SR-71 could fly at speeds exceeding Mach 3.5 and was capable of photographing over the curvature of the Earth and outrunning any missile launched at it. More important than its technical capabilities, the SR-71 is emblematic of the time and how America and the Soviet Union viewed each other. In the 1950s, President Eisenhower proposed a policy that he called open skies. The concept was the Soviet Union and the United States would allow for plane flights over each other's territory to monitor the development of nuclear missiles and the development of nuclear bomber fleets. Now, at the time, the United States estimated that the Soviets had dozens or even up to 100 ICBMs. But they were wrong. The Soviets had 4. Of course, Khrushchev did not want the United States to know this, and so he rejected the policy of open skies, instead preferring for a veil of secrecy to allow America's imagination to run wild, to breed distrust, to breed fear. And it worked. America overestimated the Soviets' missile capabilities vastly and birthed such things as the U-2 and the SR-71. Of course, open skies would become policy later with the development of spy satellites, but that's a bit further down the line. Ad astra per aspera, or to the stars through difficulties, is the state motto of Kansas. And behind this stained glass window are the stairs into the Cosmosphere's museum. So this greets you as you enter. Up at the top, it has the mission emblems for Apollo 1, STS-51L, and STS-107, missions on which all lives were lost. Their names are inscribed in brown stained glass at the top of the window, and at the bottom there is a heat shield tile from Columbia, a launch harness fragment from Apollo 1, and a heat shield tile from Challenger. Our museum begins with this as a reminder that space travel, routine as it might have become in the days of the space shuttle and the ISS, is not safe, and it's not something that is assured. People have died and they will die again. Through the deaths of these astronauts, we are reminded of what we strive to seek and find, of what we strive to learn through space travel, and we are reminded that the path to the stars is never without difficulty. An unfortunate fact of space history and space travel is that much of what we regard as the greatest achievements of humanity, rightfully so, started in the dark place of war. And this is especially true for Project Apollo and for the Soviet and American space race to the moon. It started here. This room is meant to resemble the production facilities at Nordhausen in Nazi Germany, where the V2 was built. This authentic unlaunched V2 shows you what the world's first guided ballistic missile looked like. The V2 was developed late in the war by the Nazis under the guide of Dr. Wernher von Braun, a brilliant engineer and manager who, obsessed with building rockets, developed this one for the Nazi military. The V2 was also the first man-made object to reach space on suborbital trajectories. V2s were launched at Allied territory and killed or seriously injured more than 10,000 people. But a grimmer statistic is that twice that number of concentration camp slaves died in the brutal conditions in which they built these weapons. The effect of the V2 was not just one of death and destruction during the war. It arrived too late to alter the course of World War II, but it showed something very important to the Allies, particularly to the United States and the Soviet Union. It showed them that the best and most advanced technology existed in Nazi Germany. And it spoke to the fact that whoever retrieved that technology at the end of the war would be positioned superior to the other. The V2 was not the only one of Nazi Germany's Wunderweapons. They also had the Me-163 Comet using one of these Walter 509A engines, the world's first rocket-powered aircraft, which stunned pilots who saw it flying by them with no visible propeller system of any kind. Another one of the wonder weapons was the V1. The V1 is completely distinct and separate from the V2 in an engineering sense. The two were paired together as a matter of propaganda. The V1 was an unpiloted bomb called a buzz bomb, also launched at Allied territory, primarily the southern shores of the United Kingdom. As World War II progressed through its twilight years and ultimately the Nazis lost more and more ground, the United States and the Soviet Union both started to wonder who it would be who would end up obtaining these fantastic, horrifying weapons and the technology that they possessed. A valuable prize in its own right was that of the scientists who had designed these weapons. And so both the United States and the Soviet Union raced into Nazi Germany at the end of World War II, hoping that they could be the one to obtain the most advanced pieces of technology on the planet. At the conclusion of World War II, the facilities where these horrific weapons were produced were supposed to go to the Soviet Union and become its occupied territory. In advance of that, the rocket scientists who had built these weapons under Dr. von Braun fled these areas, preferring to live in the United States rather than work under Joseph Stalin. So ultimately, they surrendered willingly to the Americans, and many, though not all of these scientists, along with technology and blueprints they had brought with them, were taken to America in what was called Operation Paperclip. Many Nazis in Operation Paperclip were expatriated to the United States, their war records expunged so long as they agreed to work for the United States government in some capacity. This would be true of Dr. von Braun and his team, who would become the forefront of rocketeering in the United States. In the Soviet Union, they did not gain the same levels of technology and scientists, but the Soviets, devastated by the war and the brutal battles in their territory, were not deterred and were determined not to fall behind the United States. The barren deserts of the southwestern United States would prove to be the home for the von Braun rocket team in the post-war years. And in different areas in the same location, there was a certain type of research going on. Test pilots, in the days before astronauts existed, were at the top of their field in aviation. And many test pilots were obsessed with pushing barriers, with breaking new ground, going faster, higher, farther. At Edwards Air Force Base, back in the days when it was known as Muroc, the Bell X-1, the first of the X-planes, was attempting to perform a feat that had never before been done, to break through the sound barrier. Engineers thought it couldn't be done. They didn't understand, as we do today, the same amount about the way that air compresses in front of a fast-moving object. But the effects were very well known. Planes approaching the speed of sound would spin out of control. Their pilots would become unable to recover. It was a dangerous area, and the test pilots at Edwards were all too happy to push into it. In 1947, test pilot Chuck Yeager pushed past the sound barrier in a Bell X-1, which he had named Glamorous Glennis after his wife. And this was the first time that any human being had done that. The plane itself is shaped like a high-caliber bullet, bullets that themselves break the sound barrier when fired from a gun. And ultimately, Yeager's push past the speed of sound would only be the first in the long line of victories for the X-planes. The X-planes would culminate with the X-15 right here. The X-15 was the world's first space plane. On 2 consecutive flights in 1961, X-15s were pushed just above the internationally recognized boundary of space. The X-15 was a dangerous beast to fly, rocket-powered, dropped like the X-1 from the belly of a carrier aircraft. In the early days, the X-15 had to use 2 of these XLR-11 engines to power itself before its much larger XLR-99 was ready. All of these being real pieces of flight hardware except for Glamorous Glennis. Ours was from the movie The Right Stuff, the real one's on display in DC. Of course, for a pilot to survive at these high altitudes, a full-body pressure suit was needed, a basic predecessor spacesuit. And that would be the XMC-2. This particular suit was worn by test pilot Joe Engle, who would later go on to become an astronaut and would fly for NASA. But back in those days, he was pushing the boundaries of aviation in the X-15. Other boundaries were pushed too in the Southwest. Boundaries such as the human boundary with the rocket sleds. This is the authentic Sonic Wind 2, the successor to Sonic Wind 1. Sonic Wind 2 never saw any human use, but Sonic Wind 1 did, producing effects such as temporary blindness or broken or cracked ribs when the occupant was pushed to extreme speeds by rocket motors at the back to test what would happen to the human body. The atmosphere was also probed by rockets, like this Araby rocket above. Amidst the positivity and hope for the future that pervaded American culture in the late 40s and early 50s was the knowledge of the growing threat from the Soviet Union. Of course, in the Soviet Union, the United States was viewed the same way. This mutual distrust can be symbolized by Uncle Sam on one side and Lenin on the other, both of them facing the Redstone warhead. The Redstone was a successor to the V-2, a very direct successor. The von Braun rocket team ultimately developed the V-2 into this rocket. The rocket was not an ICBM. Its range was limited compared to the weapons that would follow, but it was a powerful missile in America's early arsenal. Of course, in American culture, everyone was aware at the time of the growing threat. Films like Duck and Cover were shown to young kids in schools, encouraging them to hide under their desks so that they wouldn't be hurt by the effects of a nuclear blast, which is questionable advice at best. But everyone in America was aware of this growing threat that they perceived. And the Soviets saw the same. In the midst of these fears, one can find Wernher von Braun and Sergei Korolev. Sergei Korolev was a brilliant Soviet engineer and, moreover, manager, much like von Braun himself. Korolev was the head of OKB-1, which was a design bureau inside the Soviet Union. Design bureaus were tasked with specific engineering areas and with coming up with new technology in those areas. And Sergei Korolev, thrown into a gulag for years in the 30s and given lifelong physical injuries because of it, was a thorough Soviet patriot. He believed in his country, and he believed in designing the newest and best technologies for his homeland, which he would. We have here a slide rule from each of these two men, the modern mathematical implements of the day. In the United States, fears of the Soviet Union, although shared by the public, were tempered by a cautious government. Famously, US Secretary of Defense Charles Wilson said of the Soviets, "Why should we fear a people that can't even build a decent tractor?" This was in 1956. Also in that year, the United States would voice its desire to participate in the IGY, the International Geophysical Year, a loose conglomeration of different countries pledging to enact new scientific advances in their borders. As part of their efforts for the IGY, the US said they would launch a satellite into orbit. While Charlie Wilson was cautioning America from being too afraid of the Soviets had in fact built something that was very fearsome. The R-7, the world's first ICBM. The R-7 was descended from V-2 technology, much like the Redstone, and was designed to carry larger Soviet warheads. Soviet warheads were developed several years behind American warheads, and so tended to be larger and heavier and needed bigger rockets to carry them. The Soviets had the R-7, the Americans had the Redstone, and that would set the stage for the later competition that was to come. Eisenhower also came behind the idea of the formation of an independent agency to help govern space activities. In America, up to that point, space activities were military mostly. The Navy, the Air Force, and the Army all wanted a piece of the space pie. They all wanted to be the leader in space in America. But Eisenhower still supported the idea of civilian, peaceful exploration of space. And so in 1958, he signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act, which created NASA in October of that year, primarily from the existing National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics. Now, the creation of NASA actually represents an overlooked and crucial turning point in the history of the space race. Because with the creation of NASA, the United States now had a central agency governing space efforts. The military branches were still allowed to make their own space efforts if they wanted, but those efforts had to have an explicit military purpose. Otherwise, space projects would go to NASA. In the Soviet Union, no such agency would exist during the race to the moon. Space projects in the early Soviet Union were all created by Sergei Korolev's OKB-1, Sputnik 1 through 3, were all the result of one man and his agency pushing tirelessly for space exploration. And as the years would go on in the space race, Korolev would begin to lose favor inside the Soviet military and government apparatus. Korolev had to appeal to the Soviet military to get permission to use rockets for space projects. And he often did this by premiering as well to those high up in government, particularly Premier Nikita Khrushchev. If those appeals failed, he would not get his space projects. And so, as Korolev himself began to fall out of favor with Khrushchev and with those in the military, and others began to rise, space efforts in the Soviet Union became muddled, while space efforts in the United States stayed under NASA. But the year of 1958 and 1959 following it did not see such competition. In 1959, the Soviets launched the successful missions of Luna 1, Luna 2, and Luna 3. Now, Luna 1 was supposed to be a moon impactor spacecraft, and it missed, going into solar orbit, which was claimed as a victory by the Soviets, and to some extent it was, the first man-made object to break beyond the bonds of Earth's gravity. Luna 2 was successful, and it impacted the Earth in September of 1959, becoming the first man-made object on another celestial body. Both Luna 1 and Luna 2 carried one of these, a lunar sphere. The lunar sphere is made up of interlocking pennants, each of them containing either the text of CCCP in 1959 or the emblem of the Soviet Union. The spheres were designed to break apart upon hitting the lunar surface, spreading the Soviet Union over the moon in the sort of Cold War propaganda silliness that permeated the space race. Luna 3, though, was the most impressive of these Luna missions, because Luna 3 was the first satellite to photograph the far side of the moon. Using CIA film that had been captured years earlier from a spy balloon that strayed into Soviet territory, the satellite was launched beyond the moon and took photos of the far side hidden from humans for thousands of years. The film was developed on board the spacecraft and sent back with radio to Earth to show the hidden far side of the moon for the first time. The photos are primitive by today's standards. We have much better pictures nowadays, but back then, they were the first glimpses humans had of the hidden far side of our nearest neighbor. Up through 1976, 44 Luna missions were launched, and 15 of them were successful. 2 of these lunospheres exist in Kansas, one of them here in our collection, and one of them that was given by Nikita Khrushchev to President Eisenhower as a commemorative that's in his presidential library in Abilene. Great way to say, here's a piece of what you can't have. The United States was trying for its own lunar probes with the Pioneer program and would achieve success with just one of them out of 10 launches. Pioneer 4, with the insides of this backup unit cut away to show the technology, was launched successfully and put into orbit around the moon. But the United States still lagged behind the Soviet Union in 1959. Launching rockets back in those days was quite a dangerous business. Camera technology hadn't developed enough to allow for remote observation of the pad that would give good data on the rocket launch. So, rocket launches were observed from blockhouses, little tiny bunkers that were near to the rocket launch. You can see here an image of a Mercury redstone with the blockhouse only a couple hundred feet away. So in order to stay safe inside these bunkers in the event of a rocket explosion, the windows that they used to look out were 15 panes of glass thick to make sure that no explosion could penetrate into them and damage those inside. With the R-7 and the Redstone in both the United States and the Soviet Union's rocket arsenals, they were ready to face the next greatest challenge of the space race. When you've sent a satellite into orbit, when you've sent an animal into orbit, the next logical step is a person. The Soviets would answer this with Project Vostok, or the Vostok program, a single-occupant spacecraft designed to support one person for up to several days. America's answer would be Project Mercury, similarly a single-occupant spacecraft designed for a little bit less time. Vostok would be launched aboard the R-7, reliable as ever, whereas Mercury would use the Redstone for suborbital capsule flights, and then the Atlas, America's first ICBM, for orbital flights. And both sides needed the humans who would fly these vehicles. The test pilots of America became the first astronauts. The logical choice, engineers at heart, good at taking down data and being in stressful situations with quick responses. America gathered up a group of test pilots from all of the armed services and called them down to 7, the Mercury 7. The last true celebrities, one could say, in American culture, monolithic heroes who would take the fight to the Soviet Union. The Soviets gathered 20 of their best Air Force pilots, but unlike the Mercury astronauts who became instant celebrities with worldwide and particularly nationwide fame, the Soviet cosmonauts were unknowns in their country. Their names were kept secret, their training was kept secret, and they were only revealed to the public after making a successful flight. Now, here I have the remains of Mercury Atlas 1. This was the first flight of a Mercury spacecraft on top of an Atlas rocket. The Mercury spacecraft was slightly wider than the diameter of the missiles that would sit atop the Atlas, and so an adapter was needed to bridge the gap between the two. And on this particular flight, with the astronauts and all of their families watching, Mercury Atlas 1 ascended up into the heavens and broke apart less than 2 minutes into its mission. Now, it was overcast that day, so they probably didn't see it, but it was still not a fantastic start to one of the 2 crucial parts of Project Mercury. NASA would keep working, and ultimately, by the time of early 1961, Project Mercury was ready to launch a human into space. Of course, the United States would be beaten first. On April 12th of 1961, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human into space, launching on Vostok 1 into a single orbit around the Earth, landing successfully in Russia, and taking for the Soviets the grandest prize of the space race thus far. It would only be 5 days later that on a beach in Cuba, rebels backed by the CIA and the United States military would attempt a coup of the island that was highly unsuccessful, creating for the new Kennedy administration 2 embarrassments in a row, Gagarin and the Bay of Pigs. Some face was saved on May 5th, 1961, when Alan Shepard became the first American into space. But his flight was still less impressive than Gagarin's, a 15-minute suborbital hop using a Redstone rocket, as opposed to Gagarin's 90-minute orbital flight. Alan Shepard became even more of a celebrity than he already was, and America heralded that it was matching its Soviet counterpart. But to anyone watching closely, they knew that wasn't quite the case. Kennedy needed something that he could give to the American people, something to say that America would pull ahead and would be first. He went to his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, and his science advisors and asked for what America could do to catch up to the Soviets. And his advisors informed him that as early as 1955, America had been working on different pieces of something new, of a moon program. It makes sense. Once you've sent a human into orbit, the next logical place to go is either to send a human into orbit for a longer period of time or send them to our near neighbor. And so NASA had been working already for half a decade at that point on the different pieces of technology needed to send a human being to the moon. And so at the end of May 1961, before a joint meeting of Congress, President Kennedy announced to the United States and to the world that by the end of the decade, America would land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth. This was a very ambitious promise. NASA had been working on this technology, yes, since before NASA even existed, back when it was the NACA. But the technology didn't exist in a real form. America's only credit to that point was launching a single human into space for 15 minutes. And at the time, NASA only had a 39% success rate of all of its rocket launches. 6 out of every 10 failed. But Kennedy and the country needed this, needed a promise that America could pull ahead of the Soviets. And it makes sense. If you're trying to run a mile, it doesn't make as much a difference if your opponent is 5 feet ahead of you. The race to the moon would be a contest so ambitious and so audacious that both sides would be starting from a near equal point in technology to make that leap. For their part, the Soviets did not respond that they would be challenging the Americans to a moon race, and Kennedy's speech did not say a challenge to the Soviets in so many words, but it was obvious that that's what it was to the Soviets and to the world at large. And ultimately, this brings us back to our starting point, July of 1961, and the suborbital flight of Gus Grissom on Liberty Bell 7. After his flight, an investigation by NASA into the jettison of his explosive hatch ultimately produced the conclusion that he was not to blame, which was validated by later Mercury flights. So NASA continued on, although NASA began to shy away from using explosive escape hatches for its future spacecraft. Something that can't be lost in the conversation about the space race is the divided nature of not just a contest between 2 countries, but of the entire world at the time. Why race to space? Why spend immense amounts of money on this contest that ultimately by its end would prove non-military? Well, ultimately, this is because the race to space was about more than just technological conquest. It was about, on a world stage, proving which country was better, proving which ideology was better, attaining supremacy. And both the United States and the Soviet Union shared the same goal that only one of them could achieve. Countries at the time often found themselves forced to choose between the 2 ideologies, between capitalism or communism. And some countries were not offered that choice at all. Germany, at the end of World War II, was split into multiple pieces. 3 of its pieces went to the UK, the US, and France, and were consolidated into West Germany, while 1 piece went to the USSR and became East Germany, both technically independent countries, both sharing 1 capital, Berlin, that was still split between them. But ultimately, the contest between two world powers would prove intense enough as to divide this country, emblematic of the way it divided the rest of the world. These are pieces of the German Wall. Similar to the very well-known Berlin Wall, the German Wall stretched more than 860 miles of wall and fence across the entirety of Germany, intended to prevent any people from East Germany moving over into West Germany, moving from one place where the conditions were not enviable into a better side of their own country. Families and friends were split. And these two authentic pieces are bisected by the facing off President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev. As mentioned, the challenge to the moon was not direct. President Kennedy did not say that the USSR would have to beat the United States to the moon, yet the USSR did begin working on lunar programs after Kennedy's challenge. Now, the irony of these two men being the challengers, emblematic of the early parts of this race, is that neither of them would be in power to see its completion. Khrushchev was removed from power in the mid-1960s, well before the moon landings, and President Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, far before he could even see the interim Project Gemini carried out to help get America to the moon. The competition between nations would take the world to the brink of World War III. And one of the less spoken truths about the space race is that it served as a pressure valve of sort, helping to alleviate the need for direct military competition in favor of less direct technological competition in the arena of space. Of course, in those days, still one of the most supreme rockets was Korolev's R-7. This is a model of the R-7 configuration that launched the Sputnik missions into orbit. It's very similar to today's Soyuz rocket. It's directly a predecessor of that design. And crucial to its design is its clustered engines. 4 strap-on boosters around a central core, each of them with their own rocket motors, helping to launch it into space. This is a cluster of RD-107 engines, the types that are on these strap-on boosters. And it's actually a bit of a misnomer to say that it's a cluster, because this particular type of rocket motor is actually just one engine with 4 thrust chambers. The R-7 back in those days had 4 of these RD-107 engines in its strap-on boosters, with an RD-108 in the center. The difference between the 7 and 8 was just that the 7s had 2 maneuvering rockets attached, whereas the 8 had 4, so that when the strap-on boosters were jettisoned, the core stage could still maneuver itself. While the RD-107s were launching Korolev's R-7 into space, America's rocket engines were interesting designs of their own. Now, this is a simulated blockhouse designed to resemble those bunkers that they would have stayed in to watch rocket launches, with more of that 15-pane glass. The glass here is next to an A-7 rocket engine, the type of single motor that would have launched the Redstone and Juno rockets into space. While the Redstone was capable of putting Mercury into suborbital flight, Atlas, of course, was what put it into orbit. And this here is an Atlas booster engine and a start tank for that engine. Atlas had a bit of an interesting design in that it wasn't a 1 or 2 stage rocket, but more kind of a 1.5 stage rocket. It had 3 motors at its base on liftoff. And then, as it ascended, the 2 side motors would drop away, leaving the single central engine to push the rest of the way into orbit. An interesting and ingenious design. Central to our blockhouse here, we have this, the couch that flew Enos the chimp into orbit. Enos tested out the Mercury Atlas configuration before any astronaut ever flew it. The design of the cabin, similar to the spacesuits the astronaut would have worn as an extra protection in case the spacecraft depressurized, is very simple. Enos is strapped in and sits inside there. And then in front of him, he has 3 levers. The monkeys that flew these were trained ahead of time to know that upon certain light cues, they were to pull certain levers, with a red lever that they were supposed to never pull. They pulled the right lever, they got a treat. They pulled the wrong lever, they got a shock through plates that were connected to their feet. Enos grew so tired of this treatment during his flight that he somehow summoned the strength to pull a catheter out of himself without passing out, and then enjoyed the rest of his flight in a more relaxed state. The job of astronaut occupies a peculiar place. You can be an astronaut without being famous, and yet still receive attention and acclaim from people. Most astronauts' names aren't even known to the public today. But back in the early 1960s, there were 32 astronauts and cosmonauts who were all training to make the historic first space flights. 7 in America, the celebrities that they were, and 20 men in the Soviet Union, in addition to a new class of 5 women who started undergoing training in the early 1960s. Now, we already discussed in Project Mercury Alan Shepard's suborbital flight, as well as Gus Grissom's. Those were followed by an orbital flight made by John Glenn. John Glenn orbited the Earth 3 times, finally matching the Soviets' orbital achievements. But his flight had to be cut short. To follow him was his classmate, Deke Slayton. But 2 months before his flight, Deke Slayton was grounded due to an irregular heartbeat, and he ended up becoming eventually the director of flight crew operations, responsible for choosing new astronauts and assigning flight crews, among other things. So instead, John Glenn was followed by Scott Carpenter and then Wally Schirra. And Wally Schirra, in his 9-hour Mercury flight, wore this spacesuit. The Mercury spacesuit was based on the Navy Mark II design, so a bit more advanced in total than the XMC-2 we looked at earlier, but not a whole lot. Both were suits that were designed for high altitude, and then this one was adapted ultimately for space. And at those high altitudes, the difference between space and high atmosphere is pretty small. Now up above, we actually have an authentic Mercury escape tower, never used, that would have helped pulled the capsule off the top of an exploding Redstone or Atlas rocket. Following on after Schirra's spaceflight, there was only one more Mercury flight, Gordon Cooper's Faith 7, and those 6 spaceflights constituted the entirety of Mercury. In contrast, we have Vostok. Now, this capsule is not actually a Vostok capsule. Instead, it's what's known as a Zenit. Because Sergei Korolev had to sell the programs that he was making to the Soviet government and military in a way that NASA did not, many of the programs that Korolev created had a dual military purpose. In this case, the Vostok capsule he designed could be adapted and changed. The parts made for a human pulled out and replaced with spy cameras, so that the capsule could fly the film back down through the atmosphere, protecting it from the fires of re-entry for retrieval later on. This particular Zenit capsule was flown, and Zenits were flown for many decades, well after Vostoks had stopped. Now, also in contrast to Mercury, we have a Vostok suit. This is not an authentic flown suit. This is a training suit that Gagarin used while training for his flight. You can see the orange outer garment as well as the helmet with CCCP painted on it. That actually has a bit of a funny source. When Gagarin made his spaceflight, or when he was preparing to, there was nothing painted on the helmet. But it occurred to the cosmonaut flight planners at the last minute that ultimately, without any sort of designation on his helmet, if he came down somewhere in Soviet territory, he could be mistaken for an invader, and he could be potentially shot by his own people, which would have been a pretty bad ending to the Soviet Union's first spaceflight. Now, unlike the Mercury capsules, which splash down in water, similar to most modern space capsules, at least most modern American space capsules, the Vostoks were designed to come down on land. Because of the location of the Soviet Union, the Vostoks went into an orbit that was much closer to polar than equatorial. And so this orbit made it much more likely they would come down over land than in water. Now, the Vostok did have parachutes. It was designed to make a soft landing, but there were fears that the landing wouldn't be soft enough. And so the cosmonaut would sit in an ejection seat. You can see an authentic unit displayed here. Once the parachutes had deployed and the capsule was descending under them, the cosmonaut would pull a lever and the seat would eject out of the back of the capsule. And then once free of the capsule, they would unstrap from the seat and they would parachute down by themselves to a landing in Soviet territory. This created a bit of a problem when it came to flight records. The Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, the group that keeps all aeronautics records had in its rule books that any pilot attempting to make a record must land in the same craft that they had taken off in. And so technically, Gagarin parachuting down to Earth, separate of his Vostok capsule, would not qualify under the FAI rules to make the record for first orbit. So the Soviets lied and said that he came down in his capsule without ejecting, although the lie became a bit obvious when, for all 5 subsequent Vostok flights, they said that the cosmonauts had ejected. The FAI holds that the Soviet Union has the record for first orbit. So you can see the full flight configuration of a Vostok capsule here in this model, with the spherical cabin mounted above the double diamond shape of the service module, with oxygen tanks and the engines for re-entry, among other things. There were 6 Vostok flights in total. The second flight following Yuri Gagarin's was that of German Titov. It involved a full 1-day orbit. Also made German Titov the first person to experience space adaptation syndrome, or sickness and difficulty adapting to space. Later on, they would achieve technical space rendezvous. Now, the Vostok couldn't change its orbital altitude or parameters. It could change its attitude, but not the orbit it was in. But by launching Vostoks close together, the Soviets were able, on Vostoks 3 and 4 and 5 and 6, to have 2 Vostoks flying at points in close formation and in radio contact with each other. Vostok 6 also took a very important record, the first woman in space. Valentina Tereshkova became the first woman, the only one of her class of 5 to ever actually fly. Now, the Soviets touted her flight, longer than all 6 Mercury flights combined, as a victory of equality in the Soviet Union. They said that the Marxist-Leninist way of life was equal for both men and women. This was unfortunately not true. Things were about as equal in the Soviet Union for women as they were in the United States. Valentina Tereshkova would become the last woman in space for almost the next 20 years, and she herself would never fly again. So after 6 flights of Vostok, 6 flights of Mercury, both the United States and the Soviet Union were ready to move on to their moon objectives. But there's a bit of a problem with this. Going to the moon is a lot different from orbiting the Earth. Orbiting the Earth puts you a couple hundred miles up, perhaps. Orbiting the moon is a 240,000, give or take, journey each way. And you have to plan for a lot of different things. A mooncraft will have to make a journey up to potentially 2 weeks. You would like for that craft to also carry more than just one person, so that there's multiple people there. And if you're going to the moon, well, landing on it would be great as well, which means that not only will you want to be able to get out of your craft and walk around, but if you're using multiple moon landing craft, as the United States would do, those craft will need to be able to find each other in space to rendezvous and dock together. So the United States, at the conclusion of Mercury, was already planning Apollo, but they realized that an interim program would be wise, something to bridge the gap between Mercury and Apollo. They made this and they called it Gemini. Gemini had clear objectives: a multi-person spacecraft, able to be in space for up to 2 weeks, able to rendezvous and dock with a target vehicle, and capable of supporting EVA, or extravehicular activity, spacewalks. Now, the Soviets saw this too, and the Soviets did not have another craft planned. So they came up with a bit of a clever program. They called it Voskhod. Now, if you look at this model Voskhod we have here, a full engineering replica, you might see that its spherical cabin and double diamond-shaped service module are very similar to that of Vostok. And that's because the Voskhod wasn't actually different from Vostok. The Soviets took production line Vostoks that were left over, and they reconfigured the insides, added an extra set of engines, and they passed it off as a new spacecraft. Because the Soviets, without an interim program like Gemini planned, wanted to steal a few firsts away from the Americans. Now, whether this was because of an order from Premier Khrushchev or because of an obsession in Korolev of beating the Americans, that's up for debate. But Voskhod would come in and would beat the Americans. While Gemini was going through its first 2 flights, unmanned testing phases, Voskhod took the record for the first multi-person spacecraft, when 3 people fitted into a cabin originally meant for 1. These 3 people went up orbiting, happy to be serving their premier Nikita Khrushchev. They came down under the leadership of Premier Brezhnev, as Khrushchev was deposed in the meantime. Shortly before Gemini 3, the first manned launch of Gemini would fly, Voskhod 2 launched. And Voskhod 2 took away another record, a very important one, that of the first spacewalk. The Soviets had developed this suit, the Berkut, to use for their spacewalks. This is a training version right here. And on Voskhod 2, cosmonaut Alexei Leonov would become the first person to make a spacewalk in a suit just like this one. Voskhod 2 was equipped with an inflatable airlock. This right here is a training unit. The airlock was called Volga, and once in space would inflate on the side of the spacecraft. While Gemini was designed to be exposed to the vacuum of space, Voskhod could not be, because the technology inside, designed for the original Vostok, was not capable of being exposed to the harshness of a vacuum. And so with the airlock, Alexei Leonov was able to come outside of his spacecraft and make a spacewalk lasting about 20 minutes. And he enjoyed it. He had a fantastic time. But he had a problem at the end. A spacesuit is more or less a giant human-shaped balloon, right? So one of the biggest problems spacesuit designers have is how to prevent that balloon from inflating and becoming rigid and preventing the wearer from moving it around. And Alexei Leonov encountered this exact problem. When he went to get back inside his airlock, he found that his suit was stiff and inflated. He couldn't move his limbs too much. Now, he was supposed to enter the airlock feet first, so that as he entered, he could reach up and pull the hatch shut behind him. But with how badly his suit is inflated, he wasn't able to do that. Instead, he entered head first. And this put him into a dangerous position. If he couldn't manage to reach down between his feet, which requires quite a bit of flexibility that a spacesuit doesn't provide, and pull the airlock shut, he would never be able to return home. So Alexei Leonov pulled a risky maneuver. He opened the air valve on his suit, intentionally releasing air and putting himself in a race against time. Would he be able to gain enough flexibility to pull the hatch shut behind him? Or would he first pass out and eventually die in the airlock where he remained? He didn't die. He managed to pull the hatch shut behind him and then was able to get back into his spacecraft. They had more problems on the way down. They landed far off course, but Voskhod 2 made it back safely, and the Soviets had taken the record for first spacewalk. But the first spacewalk would be the last major record that the Soviets would take for quite some time, because Voskhod was not a comprehensive program. And although in America, Voskhod was believed to be a new craft, it was not. And the craft itself, based on the earlier Vostok design, was not capable of making longer and more ambitious flights. On the other hand, America's Gemini was a new craft. Now, this is a mock-up of the Mercury spacecraft in size and appearance, and you can contrast the Mercury spacecraft's bell-shaped design and shingled sides with the Gemini spacecraft, with a similar shape and shingled sides on it. Gemini looks so similar because both Mercury and Gemini were made by the McDonnell Corporation. But Gemini was a completely different beast from Mercury on the inside. A 2-seater spacecraft designed very similar to a pilot's cockpit, with both occupants looking forward, a control stick in between them, and flight instruments on a front panel. In some ways, it was the most airplane-like of any of the spacecraft. And the astronauts exerted a large design influence on Gemini to help make it that way. The hardware of Gemini was very advanced, and to fly this new spacecraft, America would need to rely on a different rocket than either Redstone or Atlas. The rocket that America chose would be the Titan II. This is a Titan II behind me. Titan II was an ICBM that followed shortly after Atlas, designed to carry nuclear missiles basically anywhere on the planet. But instead of a nuclear missile, Titan II would of course carry the Gemini spacecraft on top. Now, Titan is a two-stage rocket, so the first stage gets it most of the way to orbit, the second stage gets it all of the way as it needs to be. Titan is also a rocket that uses hypergolic fuels, or fuels that ignite on contact. Very, very toxic to humans, but generally, if they're kept apart, a bit more stable than cryogenic fuels and easier to store as well for long periods of time. Now, those kinds of fuels, hypergolic versus cryogenic, would actually lead to a disagreement in the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, Sergei Korolev favored the use of cryogenic fuels, and one of his competing designers, a man named Valentin Glushko, favored the use of hypergolic fuels. This disagreement between two men who were co-workers and at one point even friends would eventually become a bitter feud, helping to split them apart and helping to be one of the things that prevented Sergei Korolev from taking universal control over the Soviet space program. In any event, Titan II would launch all 12 of the Gemini space flights, including the 10 manned flights. Titan II would not be the only piece of existing rocketry technology adapted for use in Gemini. Gemini would also adapt the Agena. Agena was an upper stage that was developed for use in the United States military. So it was designed to push payloads into orbit. But NASA was able to adapt the Agena, with some difficulties along the way, to have a docking collar on one end that Gemini could approach and dock into. It would serve as a docking vehicle, a target that Gemini could find and use to practice rendezvous and docking techniques. And with its engine still on one end, Agena could then push the combined Gemini and Agena into higher orbits to test high-speed re-entry techniques. To go ahead and complete Gemini's ambitious objectives, NASA would need more astronauts than its existing 7. At that point, 6 with Deke Slayton grounded. So in 1962, NASA hired on a group of 9 new astronauts, including famous astronauts like Neil Armstrong or Jim Lovell. And in 1963, 14 more would follow, including Buzz Aldrin, whose Letterman jacket from West Point is seen here. Gemini would need other smaller new technologies to complement its new spacecraft. These would be technologies like a new spacesuit, capable of supporting an astronaut during a proper extravehicular activity, which had not been done during Mercury. Gemini would also use fuel cells. Now, fuel cells are an incredible technology that take cryogenic oxygen and hydrogen and mix them together to create electricity and water. Instead of relying on heavy batteries, fuel cells are much lighter and can last much longer, and they provide drinking water to the spacecraft. In order to fully take advantage of their planned EVA, NASA also developed the AMU, or the Astronaut Maneuvering Unit, a backpack unit that the astronaut could retrieve from the back of the Gemini spacecraft and use to zip around the spacecraft and test maneuverability in space. Gemini 3, the first manned Gemini flight, was originally to be flown by Alan Shepard, America's first astronaut. But shortly before the flight, he was diagnosed with Meniere's disease, an inner ear condition that grounded him. He was replaced by Gus Grissom, America's second astronaut, and Grissom flew the flight successfully. Gemini 4 would see Ed White become America's first spacewalker only a short time after Alexei Leonov's spacewalk. And then Gemini 6 and Gemini 7 would attempt the first rendezvous in space with each other, coming to within a short distance from one another. Gemini 7 was also a long-duration mission, lasting 2 weeks, and seeing astronauts Frank Borman and Jim Lovell in what was essentially the same size as the front seat of a sedan for 14 days with each other. They were both professionals, they both got through it, though it didn't help that Jim Lovell lost his toothbrush after the first day, floated off into some corner of the spacecraft, and they had to share. Gemini 8 would accomplish the first successful docking, piloted by Neil Armstrong and Dave Scott. Although shortly after docking with their Agena, they had to undock after a stuck thruster on Gemini caused them to tumble, and their mission was cut short. Then Gemini 9 would see astronaut Eugene Cernan attempt a longer spacewalk using the AMU, a spacewalk that almost killed him after exertion caused his spacesuit to fill with sweat, and the man himself almost passed out. Then came Gemini 10, which is the spacecraft we have here. Gemini 10 was flown by John Young, a veteran of Gemini 3, and Michael Collins, a rookie. And Gemini 10 achieved a successful docking with an Agena target vehicle, staying docked for the time that it was supposed to. They then boosted themselves up to the abandoned Agena of Gemini 8, where Michael Collins attempted an incredible spacewalk, leaping off of his Gemini over to the Gemini 8 Agena to retrieve an experiment package left on board. The spacesuit that he used to make that spacewalk is on display here, a bit yellowed from the adhesives that were used inside of it. In the end, the remaining 2 flights of Gemini would complete all of Gemini's objectives, particularly with Gemini 12, including a 5-hour spacewalk by rookie astronaut Buzz Aldrin, proving that EVA techniques could be used and paving the way for Apollo. For their part, the Soviets were not without actions that they wanted to take. In 1965, Sergei Korolev finally managed to get permission from the Soviet government to put the entire Soviet lunar effort underneath his command. But ultimately, Korolev's command of the Soviet lunar effort would be short-lived. Now, under his command, both before and after he took full control, there did develop plans for a new spacecraft called Soyuz and a gigantic rocket called the N-1 of similar lifting capability to America's Saturn V moon rocket. But before these plans could come to full fruition, Sergei Korolev died. In January of 1966, he went in for a routine operation to a hospital and a tumor was found in his abdomen. And from excessive bleeding during the attempt to remove it, he passed away. He received a state funeral. His name, which had been kept secret during the entire time that he was chief designer of the Soviet space program, was finally made public, and the Soviet space program began to flounder without him at its helm. Now, ultimately, this would not be the only loss for the Soviet Union, because a year later, in 1967, the Soviets would lose their greatest hero, their golden boy, Yuri Gagarin, in a plane crash. Among the objects recovered from the plane crash site were Gagarin's wallet containing a picture of Sergei Korolev, a man with whom he had a surrogate father-son relationship. While these tragic events going on in the Soviet Union were seen and appreciated for their tragedy by the American astronauts still pushed on ahead to the moon. With the end of Gemini and full steam ahead on Apollo, America would need to focus all of its efforts on getting to the moon. And these efforts included the need to finish the Titanic Saturn V moon rocket. Now, this period of space exploration is special to me. It holds a special place in my heart, because for the first time in space travel history, people would be flying to space on a rocket designed not for war, but instead entirely for peaceful and scientific exploration. The Saturn V was designed with engineering objectives in mind, with only being used for science as its goal. And that's, I think, really special. The Saturn V was a titanic monster, 363 feet tall, toe-to-tip, more than 3 times the size of Gemini's Titan II. It was powered by 5 enormous F1 engines, putting out a vast amount of horsepower just to lift this rocket off the surface of the Earth. Now, the first stage, using RP-1, a kerosene fuel and liquid oxygen, went up until right about here. And that first stage fired for the first 2.5 minutes only, just enough to get Saturn V through the worst of Earth's gravity and atmosphere. At that point, the second stage, powered by 5 J2 engines and liquid hydrogen and oxygen, took over. And the second stage would get the Saturn V almost all the way to orbit. The final leg to orbit would be completed by the S4B, Saturn V's third stage, powered by 1 J2 engine and also using liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. And after that point, the third stage would stay attached, carrying this combined spacecraft, the lunar lander, and the command and service modules of Saturn V into orbit. And just for scale, you can see at the very tip of this rocket, these 3 tiny astronauts to show how gigantic this mammoth piece of machinery is. The command and service module mothership would stay in orbit around the moon while the lunar module landed on the moon. And then the two astronauts in the lunar module would rejoin their single counterpart who had stayed in the command and service module, and together all three of them would head for home, with only the tiny gumdrop-shaped command module coming back to Earth after the flight, the fantastic voyage of the entire Saturn V. By 1967, Saturn V was not quite ready and still needed more development. So the first Apollo flight would go using a different rocket, the Saturn 1B, a predecessor that had been earlier developed to test out other Saturn V technologies. The first Apollo flight's main mission was to test the command and service modules in Earth orbit. The command and service modules, of course, being necessary to get back from the moon. But this objective would never be achieved. In late January of 1967, a fire broke out inside the spacecraft during a routine test. And inside of the spacecraft's 100% oxygen environment, pressurized to over sea levels 14.7 psi, the fire spread quickly, and the astronauts inside suffocated from toxic flames and smoke inhalation in less than 30 seconds. Now, these astronauts were not able to get out in large part because of the spacecraft's hatch. Not only did it open inwards, but it also was a complicated design that did not allow for fast opening. Had the spacecraft been equipped with a different hatch, such as an explosive hatch, they might have been able to get out in a hurry, but NASA had shied away from the use of explosive hatches after Gus Grissom's near brush with death on Liberty Bell 7. The final irony here is that Apollo 1 was crewed by rookie astronaut Roger Chaffee, America's first spacewalker Ed White, and veteran astronaut Gus Grissom, all three of them lost in the fire. The fire caused a lot of soul searching at NASA, but also left a lot of time for NASA engineers to catch up with pieces of the moon program that were not yet finished. The Saturn V received more time development, and it would be 21 months before NASA would finally fly another flight with Apollo 7. Apollo 7 was largely the originally intended Apollo 1, commanded by Mercury astronaut Wally Schirra, the only person to fly Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. Apollo 7 launched on a Saturn 1B and carried out a 10-day mission in Earth orbit, fully testing the command and service modules and certifying that they were ready for flight. Now, in the interim time, the Saturn V had received 2 tests of varying degrees of success. To get such a gigantic rocket out to the launch pad is a complex journey. The Saturn V is assembled vertically in what's known as the Vertical Assembly Building in Kennedy Space Center. And then in this vertical position, it's rolled out to the launch pad, a journey of more than a mile. To accomplish this is a mobile crawler system that gets Saturn V the entire distance it needs to go. This crawler uses a concept similar to tank treads to help carry the rocket, and one of these treads or shoes is displayed here. This is an authentic one of the 456 such shoes on the 8 separate treads of the crawler. The crawler was certainly not a hot rod. It traveled at less than 1 mile per hour on average, and it only got about 2 IPG, or inches per gallon, as it made its slow crawl out to the Apollo launch pad with its gigantic rocket payload in tow. On top of the Saturn V stack would be the White Room. The White Room we have here is an authentic Apollo White Room used during the program by astronauts. After riding an elevator to the top of the launch umbilical tower, the Apollo astronauts would come to be in the White Room as the last place before boarding their spacecraft that they would stand on Earth. So here they would have final suit checkouts performed, and then they would climb into their spacecraft, which would sit against the curved opening here, and be fastened into place for their flight into space. Their final moments on Earth occurred in this room, and it's signed by the historic pad leader of the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs, Günter Wendt, a German emigre who came over with the von Braun team, who was known as the Pad Führer, both for his German heritage and also for his meticulous nature on the pad. The White Room was perfectly positioned to sit up against the Apollo spacecraft on top of the entire Saturn V stack. Like I said, the only piece to come safely back to Earth. With much more interior room than its Mercury and Gemini predecessors, the Apollo spacecraft was a true craft for living and working and designed to support its astronauts on the way to the moon. A crucial piece of Apollo that was reworked after the fire was the hatch. Before the fire, the Apollo spacecraft had a complicated three-piece hatch that opened inwards. With the internal pressure of a fire, there was no physical way that the Apollo 1 astronauts could have opened such a hatch, even if it wasn't complex, taking up to 90 seconds to open in the best of circumstances. The new Apollo hatch was a simple one-piece outward opening design that could be opened in a matter of moments in the event of an emergency. Apollo 7 tested this full spacecraft on its flight, proving that the command module was ready. And Apollo 8 took the command module farther than any spacecraft had gone before on a daring mission to go into orbit around the moon, 10 orbits around a world where no human had ever gone before, making Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders the first humans to break free of Earth's gravity. They photographed the moon's surface and proved that the command module could withstand a flight out to the moon and back. But the command module was, of course, not the only spacecraft in Project Apollo. The ingenious lunar module, or LEM, was the other spacecraft that Apollo needed to complete its mission to the moon. A two-stage spacecraft in its own right, the LEM carried a descent engine, throttleable, for landing on the moon, and then carried a separate ascent engine in order to get back into orbit. The bottom portion of the LEM, called the descent stage, which housed its legs and scientific experiments as well as other equipment, would be responsible for getting the astronauts down to the moon, and then would serve as a launch pad for the top portion, or the ascent stage, the cabin, which would allow the astronauts to blast off back into lunar orbit to meet their orbiting command and service module counterpart, and later return to the Earth. Our other LEM is an ascent stage only, and shows the cramped interior quarters of the LEM that would have been designed to house 2 astronauts for hours or days at a time. The LEM ascent stage, not an aerodynamic thing designed only for operation in space, did away with any sort of seats for landing. Instead, the astronauts would be anchored by their feet and their waist to stand in place for landing, which also put them closer to the LEM's small windows, giving them a greater field of vision. The LEM was a cramped little home for hours or days for the astronauts. Inside, the ascent engine took up a sizable amount of the room available, and the rest of it was left for the spacesuits, the equipment the astronauts had, lunar samples brought back from the surface, food, and on later flights, the hammocks the astronauts would string up to sleep in. The LEM wasn't prepared for flight by Apollo 8, but it was ready for the Earth orbital flight test of Apollo 9, the first test of the complete command and service module and LEM configuration. Apollo 9 tested a lot of crucial objectives, but one of the most important was that of docking between the command and service module and the LEM. This maneuver was extremely necessary. Without it, you couldn't recover astronauts from the surface of the moon who had flown back up in their LEM ascent stage. The probe of the command and service module would dock into the drogue of the LEM before both of them were pneumatically pulled together and latches caught to keep them locked. There's not a whole lot of space in this docking tunnel, but in the microgravity environment, it's enough to make it. Apollo 9 successfully tested this several different times and proved that it could be done. And after that, Apollo 10 tested the entire command and service module and LEM again, but this time in lunar orbit. Apollo 10, as an interesting side note, was the only flight where all of the astronauts had flown once before and would fly again. Veterans Tom Stafford, John Young, and Gene Cernan. And Apollo 10, crucially, got to within 14 miles of the moon's surface, a full dress rehearsal of the lunar landing, to prove that Apollo was ready to make its key flight to land on the moon. All of the fancy hardware of Apollo was revolutionary for its time, but one of the most, if not the most complicated piece of hardware in Apollo was the human system, the people inside the spacecraft. And to help them function, NASA had to make sure that they had food that they could eat. The food was freeze-dried and dehydrated for the most part, rehydrated with water from their fuel cells. And while it was better than the Gemini and Mercury food that had preceded it, it was still varying degrees of edible. But they had meals that were compact. This, for example, is a full day's worth of backup meals for the Apollo 8 mission. And they had such innovations as liquid salt and condiments that they could put on their food as needed. Of course, food and a flight entails the need to go to the bathroom. And unless you're like Apollo 8 astronaut Bill Anders, who avoided going to the bathroom for their entire 6-day flight, at least avoided number 2, you'll have to use it. So the urine transfer system is what they used inside the spacecraft, basically a roll-on condom that they could use to eject their pee outside of the spacecraft. For poop, it was a little less elegant. They would use bags with adhesive that they would stick onto themselves, and then they would do their business in before rolling them up and putting them in a box so that the scientists back on Earth could inspect it, of course. If you're out on the moon or in your spacesuit, things get a little even worse. A belt would be worn with a similar device to the urine transfer system for pee, but for poop they had the fecal management subsystem. Nice name given to what was, with all pretense removed, a diaper for the astronauts in case they needed it on the lunar surface. Apollo 10 and its preceding flights had tested the A7L, the Apollo spacesuit, truly a revolutionary piece of gear. The A7L was a true spacesuit, unlike the suits that had preceded it, which were adapted from other pressure suits. It was designed to withstand all the rigors of the dangerous lunar environment to protect the astronauts from extreme heat, cold, radiation, micrometeoroid strikes, and everything of the like. This suit right here was the one worn by astronaut Michael Collins during his training. Michael Collins would have used this suit in his training for Apollo 11, which was made possible by the success of Apollo 10. Apollo 11 launched on the 16th of July, 1969, and came in for a landing on the 20th of July. Now, the version of the A7L suit worn by astronauts on the moon's surface had to have some additional add-ons, unlike the one that Michael Collins would have worn only inside the command module. These add-ons included the PLIS backpack, capable of sustaining an astronaut for hours on the lunar surface, and its emergency OPS unit, which would have kept the astronauts alive if the PLIS failed. Additional protections included the iconic LEVA visor, the gold visor worn by the astronauts on the lunar surface, made of actual gold, 22-karat gold, to help protect them from rays bouncing off of the moon's surface. Their gloves and boots were also specially developed to protect them from the extreme temperatures that the baking hot lunar surface would reach. Apollo 11, of course, successfully landed on the 20th of July, and astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin spent some time on the surface in one short EVA. With them, they took personal objects. Each astronaut was allotted one personal preference kit, or PPK, to take mementos to the moon. Armstrong didn't use this specific PPK, but he did take this specific flag and this piece of the Wright Flyer, the first aircraft to achieve sustained heavier-than-air flight. With them, though, they brought back objects, and what they brought back was more important than what they took. This is one of the moon rocks, or half of one of the moon rocks, that Apollo 11 brought back from the surface of the moon. One of the only Apollo 11 moon rocks displayed anywhere in the world. It's estimated at an age of about 3.4 billion years. And these rocks helped tell us about the formation of our solar system and our own planet. Now, Apollo 11 was followed by Apollo 12, roughly a repeat flight. But Apollo 12 included artist astronaut Alan Bean, a test pilot like his compatriots, but an artist at heart, who after Apollo reasoned that he had an obligation to paint what he had seen on the moon's surface, to help show people who couldn't be there what it was like on that alien body. His paintings are impressed with tools and boots that he used on the moon's surface into their wet surface, and each of his paintings has a small bit of moon dust that he brought back with him. After Apollo 12, Apollo 13 was supposed to be a similar repeat of the short lunar landing mission, but it didn't go that way. While much of the American public might have come to see the Apollo flights as routine, Apollo 13, even before its disaster, was not supposed to be routine. They were landing on the moon. But 4 days into the flight, shortly before the astronauts reached their lunar orbit, one of the cryogenic oxygen tanks on board the spacecraft's service module exploded due to a faulty wire inside. These oxygen tanks were meant to provide liquid oxygen to the fuel cells of the Apollo spacecraft, which, like their Gemini counterparts, provided power and water. This scale model of Apollo 13 shows a rough recreation of what the damage looked like after the oxygen tank blew in Odyssey's service module. The other oxygen tank was compromised enough that it began leaking its oxygen, and thankfully the liquid hydrogen tank, the larger cylindrical tank, was unaffected. Of course, this crippled the Odyssey and ruled out any possibility of a lunar landing. The real spacecraft Odyssey is here behind me, and it helped serve as home for the astronauts during the next several days as they struggled to reach home. But, of course, more important than their command module was their lunar module, Aquarius, which was still fully equipped with all of its provisions to help get 2 astronauts to the moon and back. Aquarius became an unintended lifeboat. You saw how small the inside of that LEM was, and for 3 people it was a very cramped and uncomfortable space for several days. But the astronauts of Apollo 13 made it back safely in one piece. Unfortunately, Commander Jim Lovell, on his 4th flight at that point, did not need his lunar landing suit, which we have displayed here, free of the moon dust that it would have encountered and found itself colored by if he had landed on the moon. After Apollo 13, Apollo continued ahead, with Apollo 14 proving to be a more ambitious flight than those to come. Apollo 14 was to be the last short-duration mission on the moon, commanded by Alan Shepard after his Meniere's disease had been healed and he was returned to flight status, the only Mercury astronaut to command a lunar landing mission. Apollo 14 carried a lunar cart with it to help enable them to gather more samples from the lunar surface, but for upcoming missions, new advances were needed. The A7L suit became the A7LB, a more advanced version. This one is a training suit, whereas this was Eugene Cernan's backup suit for the Apollo 17 mission. Evolving out of the MET cart and the desire to conduct more advanced missions, one of the most interesting pieces of equipment to come out of Apollo, memorialized in pop culture, is the lunar rover. The lunar rover was a fascinating piece of equipment, folded up entirely inside the LEM descent stage and sprung out once on the surface of the moon. Each rover cost more than $6 million and was designed to allow for much longer surface exploration, more extensive forays out into the wilds of the moon. During the later days of Apollo, support for the program waned, and so cameras, which have been used by NASA throughout much of its history, were more important than ever to communicate to the public NASA's mission and show them the strange and wonderful places that the Apollo astronauts were able to visit. The Cosmosphere has one of the most comprehensive collections of space cameras out of any museum on the planet, including this Hasselblad, the only camera to be returned from the lunar surface. Normally the cameras were discarded for weight with only their film magazines brought back. This one was brought back on accident. Now, Apollo unfortunately wrapped up its lunar exploration with Apollo 17. After that, the missions of NASA started to become increasingly science-focused, as they had at the end of the Apollo program. This included Skylab, the successor to the Apollo lunar landings, with a space station made out of the upper rocket stage of a Saturn V. Skylab was not the world's first space station, but it was America's first, visited 3 times by crews in the early 1970s. But it would not prove to be the end of Project Apollo. In the years before, during, and after the Apollo program, many people in the United States and abroad questioned the massive expenditure of money that was required to ultimately put 12 people on the moon and return them safely to Earth. On the morning of the Apollo 11 launch, Dr. Ralph Abernathy, the leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and successor to the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., led a protest along with others, against the impending launch to the moon. They voiced objections to the spending of billions of taxpayer dollars on sending 2 men to the moon to come back with a few rocks. They couldn't see how that kind of a project, with its massive money, with so little of a concrete return, could be justified when America's cities and infrastructure were crumbling and when its citizens did not seem supported by its government. And even as a space enthusiast, I can only see the validity in their concerns. Apollo did cost a great deal, and it did seem to return very little compared to that cost. I think reflecting on Apollo for that reason is a valuable exercise. It makes sense to ask ourselves, what was the benefit of this great adventure? Of course, many people will cite the scientific gains, whether in new engineering and technologies, spin-off things that went from NASA to the public sphere, or perhaps in the science and knowledge gained about our place in our solar system and our origins. People can also cite the economic benefits in those spin-off technologies and also in the centers who held Apollo manufacturing facilities, the people employed, the towns and cities forever changed. But I think that these things are minimal. They don't mean as much compared with the way that Apollo affected the soul of the entire world. When people around the world viewed the Apollo 11 moon landing, they viewed it during a particular time, a time of upheaval like little else since. 1968 and 1969 were years of violence and war, and people around the world were weary and tired of it, ready to stop seeing the dead and to stop being afraid of nuclear hellfire. And so the unexpected benefit of Apollo in seeing these men orbit the moon and walk on its surface, and seeing them come back and knowing that these titans were flesh and blood, brought people to say, not that 2 men had done it, not that America had done it, but that we had done it, that we landed on the moon, the entire world. The collective benefit of a feeling towards what humanity could accomplish when it put its energies, its time and money towards such a massive endeavor was uplifting to the world in a way that nothing else has ever been. And it demonstrated to humankind that our species can accomplish great things if we can only dream and aim to see those dreams come true. In thinking on Apollo, I'm reminded of a quote by Robert Wilson, a man who was defending to the Senate a request for funding to build a particle accelerator, which we today call Fermilab. Wilson, when asked if there was a benefit to the defense of the country in his accelerator, said, "It has to do with, are we good painters, good sculptors, great poets? I mean, it has to do with all the things that we venerate and honor and are really patriotic about. This new knowledge, it has to do with honor and country, and it has nothing to do directly with the defense of the country, except to make it worth defending." For the Soviet side of things, development on Sergei Korolev's Soyuz did continue after his death, along with a rocket the size of the Saturn V called the N-1. But the first Soyuz flight killed its lone cosmonaut, Vladimir Komarov, and the 11th Soyuz flight killed all 3 of its cosmonauts, the only fatalities to have occurred in outer space. The N-1, for its part, also had repeated failures, 4 of them, including one of the largest non-nuclear artificial explosions in human history. So the Soviets refocused their attention to continue development on Soyuz and now on Salyut, a series of space stations. But the final end to the space race came in 1975 with a mission unlike any before it, the Apollo-Soyuz test project. The idea of an international mission was floated as early as 1962 by President Kennedy, but nothing came of it until after the moon landings had been achieved, when the Americans were finally willing to entertain the notion of a joint international venture, and the Soviets were too. Apollo-Soyuz would coalesce in July of 1975 to involve a docking between the final Apollo spacecraft, outfitted with a special adapter, and the 19th Soyuz flight. The Soyuz flight was commanded by the world's first spacewalker, Alexei Leonov, and the Apollo flight was crewed by veteran astronaut Tom Stafford and Mercury astronaut Deke Slayton, finally cleared of his heart problem for his first and only spaceflight. The groundwork laid in the international mission of Apollo-Soyuz would form the basis for later international cooperation that we know in space today. The Soviets continued with the Soyuz program after the Apollo-Soyuz test project, a program that still continues today, although the Americans, for their part, moved on to the space shuttle. Ambitious plans for a fleet of space shuttles, a large space station, lunar base, and a mission to Mars gave out with the Nixon administration, and all that was allotted for was the space shuttle, developed from early designs over the course of the Nixon, Ford, and Carter administration into its final form. The space shuttle was tested with the flights of the test article Enterprise before finally being flown for the first time in 1981, with early flight suits adapted from those worn by SR-71 pilots. The space shuttle would see a lot of advances in technology. Launched like a rocket, it was landed like a plane, with replaceable heat shield tiles protecting its underside and its wings primarily, to help ensure that it could be reused on the ground. The space shuttle would also see new comfort technologies pioneered for the astronauts. Gone were the days of poop bags and urine devices. Instead, space shuttles would have full toilets like this mock-up, which used suction to help draw out their waste. The personal kits of the astronauts became more comprehensive. Food included new foamed versions of popular sodas and different meals that were not just rehydrated or freeze-dried, but made in the oven. Clothing became expanded to include a variety of options, and science was the name of the game during the shuttle era, with advances in cameras and filmmaking techniques, computers, and spacewalking equipment that were concurrent with advances in the world around the space shuttle. The space shuttle was also important for the advances it saw in representation. Gone were the days of astronauts being only white men. Now people of color and American women also flew alongside their counterparts to make a diverse astronaut corps that matched better the country spending money on and launching these space missions. The Soviets continued development of their Salyut stations, and Salyut eventually became Mir, the world's first true space station, a modular station assembled on orbit. Although the spirit of cooperation of Apollo-Soyuz would not be present for many decades, in the 1990s, cooperation again began with the shuttle Mir missions that saw NASA astronauts and Russian cosmonauts flying together on shuttles and Soyuz craft to and from the Mir space station. Ultimately, Mir became the basis for what we today know as the International Space Station. The ISS is the collaborative project of 16 separate countries, a football field long with the interior volume of a 5-bedroom house. Today it houses around 6 people on average, and it allows for people from all nations to work together, performing science daily, day in and day out, with a continuous human presence since late 2001. International cooperation needs to be the name of the game when it comes to modern spaceflight, for its cost-sharing benefits and for the knowledge-sharing benefits that it grants. But commercial cooperation will also need to play a part in future space travel. This mock-up of Spaceship One, which is today evolved into Virgin Galactic Spaceship Two, is only one artifact of the growing commercial space industry, with such prominent partners as Blue Origin or SpaceX helping to make space more accessible and more affordable so that groups like NASA can focus on organizing missions and providing the human power behind exploring space. The Cosmosphere story of the space race ends where it began, in the lobby. Under the wings of the T-38 Talon, the astronauts' training plane, and a full-scale mock-up of Space Shuttle Endeavour, sits still in a restored state from its time at the bottom of the ocean, Gus Grissom's Liberty Bell 7. The technology in this capsule is outdated for today, but for the time, it was massively advanced. And while Gus Grissom could not have known the space adventures that would come after his time, he and the other astronauts of Mercury, Vostok, Gemini, Voskhod, Apollo, and Soyuz helped pave the way for today's modern environment of international cooperation, of preparing to return to the moon and one day go to Mars. The Cosmosphere's collection tells these stories, and I hope the way that this narrative of achievement and triumph and loss has been portrayed has given you a greater appreciation for one of mankind's greatest adventures. Okay.